Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 5-0 podcast. Today, I am incredibly honored to have our guest, Professor Jody Armour. I met Mr. Armour a few years ago, right when I had first founded the Institute. And since then, I've had the privilege to sit down and talk with him a handful of times. And we've had really long, wide-ranging discussions about criminal justice reform and Black Lives Matter and intersectionality of race and the criminal justice system. For those of you who aren't familiar, since 1995, Mr. Armour's been the Roy P. Crocker Professor at the Professor of Law at the University of Southern California, teaching students a diverse array of students, including criminal law, torts, stereotypes, and prejudice. After graduating Harvard and law school at UC Berkeley, he's since been a widely sought out scholar, lecturer, and author. Jody has a new book out which examines critical race theory, mass incarceration, criminal justice reform, and much more. I'll say, even describing this small blurb, it really doesn't do any justice because you really tackle so many critical issues that are on all of our minds today. So if you have not read Mr. Armour's book, there'll be a link below, and you'll be able to find several sources to get your hands on this valuable literature, as well as links to Jody's website, and follow him on Twitter. So I wanted to really just kind of start by saying that when I was reading your book, I was taking notes about what questions that I really thought that we could dive into, and you made it a little difficult because there was a lot. There's an immense amount of information here that I think is so topical today, but especially because getting to know you over the last 4 or 5 years is that I've heard you speak about this not only publicly but in our discussions as well. So I thought that the best thing to do is for us to start out, you introduce the book and share a crux of what the writing is about.
Great, Randy. Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. Loved our conversations through the years. And this book is titled it has a title that's difficult to utter for many folk. When I've been interviewed by TV anchors or radio anchors or podcasts or, shows like this, folk often will balk at uttering the N-word itself, which is in the title. The title of the book is N**GGA Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice in the Law. And I say at the beginning of the book, the reason I put that asterisk in there is because even though the word itself, nigga, is critical to this analysis that I go into in the book, I don't want non-Black people to become too emboldened or too comfortable about uttering the word, because it is such a blood-soaked epithet with deep roots in chattel slavery. And Black folk have been the targets of the epithet historically. And so as historical targets of the epithet, of course, we, as Black folk, are in a position to use that word with irony, with a sense of irony that those who are not historical targets of the epithet simply cannot use it with the same kind of irony. They can't invert, flip, transvalue it the way some Black writers and artists have. So while it's both a word that wounds when used to denigrate and monsterize and demonize and otherize, it is also a word that, when used by Black artists and writers, can be like a scalpel that sutures the places where blood flows. When somebody like Tupac Shakur, for example, says in his Solidarity Dirge, life goes on, the hook is, how many brothers fell victim to the street? Rest in peace, young nigga. There's a heaven for a G. I'd be a lie if I told you that I never thought of death. my niggas, we the last ones left. When he's using the N-word there, he's using it as a term of endearment, as an assertion of solidarity, not as a word that's meant to distinguish and distance and denigrate and demonize. Let me give it to you. Let me show you how the word is used in that way, in that sense, because it is also still very much used in that way with the A form as well as the ER form. But so sometimes people try to make a distinction on the basis of it has no weight at all. Drop that, lose it. For example, Chris Rock, and this is part of where I get the title of the book from, Randy. Chris Rock, in one of his most famous routines, actually the one that launched his comedic career back in 1996, Bring the Pain, goes back and forth in front of just about all black audience in Chocolate City of all places, DC, and says, who's more racist, black people or white people? He starts out with. He says, black people, because black people hate black people too. Then he says, it's like a civil war going on in black America, and there are two sides. There are black people and there are niggas. And niggas have got to go. I love black people, but I hate niggas. Boy, I wish they let me join the Ku Klux Klan. See, I do a drive-by from here to Brooklyn. And he goes on like that for half an hour, Randy, right? Blasting, demonizing, so-called N-words, right? And what's his core definition of a so-called nigga? When you go through his enumerated list and distill it down, you find that it boils down to a black criminal, a morally condemnable black criminal. Well, by that definition, the up to 90% of young black males in some of these inner city neighborhoods are going to wind up in jail, on probation, on parole at some point in their lives are niggas. We're willing to relegate them to that ultimate expression of otherness, that area, that region of demonization, dehumanization. Yes, we were willing to do that. The black community was, as well as the white community in the 90s. That's why you were getting all the laughs. That's why you were getting all the amens and uh-huhs.
Well, and I would challenge Rock's statement, because what's the equivalence in the white community, right? I mean, there's plenty of white folks that that have been convicted of crimes as well, for which that we don't assign an epithet so hurtful and so painful, to box them in or to otherize, as you said.
I hear you 100%, Randy. I think that though he would respond with something like, well, I am not going to, I'll call Charles Manson, I'll call him a wicked monster too. Mm-hmm. I'll otherize Charles Manson. I'll otherize white child molesters. For example, they would say, I'll otherize, white people who do violent crimes, especially. I'll monsterize and otherize them too. Yeah, I don't have a word like the N-word that has a specific racial history that, makes it even more biting and more acerbic. But I think they would still say, I am very comfortable with demonizing, monsterizing, dehumanizing, and otherwising whites too, especially who commit violent crimes. And that's really what my book is getting at, Randy. I'm trying to say that whether you're white, black, Asian, Latino, Latinx, whatever your social category you fit into, I don't want to monsterize, dehumanize, or demonize you for any crime you commit, whatever it is. And that's really what I'm striving to get at.
Yeah, and I hear you and really agree. I think that I think my greater point is that the use of the N-word then becomes an additional weapon, yep. Right? Is that yes, which I was getting ready to lead into about talking about the differences between violent and nonviolent criminals and how we view that in our society. But it just seems to me that this becomes an additional weapon. This becomes an additional way to cut in ways that that do predominantly or in totality impact the Black community, that white folks, even if doing more heinous crimes, quote unquote, would never have to experience. So,
what supports your point, Randy, is the studies. And this is one of the other reasons I use the N-word in the title. The studies by people like Jennifer Eberhard up at Stanford and others that show when you ask subjects to determine whether somebody is death worthy, whether they deserve capital punishment, whether they're death worthy. Number one, of course, they're more likely to determine that the person is death worthy if they're Black than if they're white, but they're also more likely to deem them more death worthy the Blacker they are, the darker they are, right? There's something about our moral judgments, how we make moral judgments, such that when we see someone Black who has committed some kind of wrongdoing, we are much more likely to attribute that wrongdoing not to some situational pressures, not to some, human frailty, but to a depraved and wicked heart. And then that makes it much easier for us to dehumanize, depersonalize, what I call niggerize, and therefore treat as just so much toxic human waste.
Absolutely. So in your book, and I remember you and I talking about this at lunch on the campus of USC, where we were talking about Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and about examining mass incarceration and who is, who are the bodies that are filling up our prisons, and you pointed out, that Alexander, as well as others, will tend to rely on looking at people who have only committed quote unquote nonviolent crimes as the targets for which we can ease mass incarceration, while simultaneously kind of jumping on board of this idea that those who have committed more serious crimes or more violent crimes, that it's okay for them to remain into the prison system. Am I describing that accurately?
Absolutely. There is a fatal factual flaw at the heart of Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow narrative. She says repeatedly and explicitly that the way we went from 300,000 people behind bars in 1980 to 2.2 million by the time we get to the mid-aughts is by the arrest and conviction and caging of low-level nonviolent drug offenders. She makes that super clear. And if that is the nature of the problem, then the solution is very simple, and it's a solution that can fit within our conventional moral framework. And the solution is to let out low-level nonviolent drug offenders. We don't need to change our ordinary moral compass to make allowances for such people, because they are just like the rest of us. They're ordinary people. Who of us haven't sinned? A lot of times, like we found with smoking marijuana, they were cracking down on blacks a lot more than non-blacks for the same activity. Everybody was doing it. They're doing it behind their own in their own homes, and it's no big deal. So we could do a lot about getting rid of mass incarceration on the cheap, if that was the only problem. The problem is that's not the problem. The problem is that, as John Pfaff, PFAFF, shows in his book Locked In, that when you look at the state system, which is where 87% of the prisoners reside, people in prison reside, that in the state system, only 5 to 6% of prisoners could be characterized as low-level nonviolent offenders. Right? Low-level nonviolent drug offenders, at most 5 to 6%. And that's probably an inflated number for a lot of reasons that he goes into. I know when I take my students up to San Quentin, for example, as I have through the years, I see virtually none. I have yet to see, I'm not saying they're not there. I haven't met everyone in there in San Quentin. I have yet to meet the low-level nonviolent drug offender who's in there for a long bid. I have yet to meet him.
Is she conflating jail sentencing with prison sentencing?
No, she's even staying within the prison, even with respect to that, and that was her focus. She was really, one of her mistakes was she focused on the federal prison system. And that's only about 12, 13% most of, so the states is 87%. In the federal system, it looks more like 50% or so of the people there are there for drug crimes, however you characterize them. But it's not close when you get to the state system, which is where 87% of the prisons are. So you're not going to be able to make deep cuts in mass incarceration, what I call racialized mass incarceration. You're not going to be able to make deep cuts in that by releasing a lot of low-level nonviolent drug offenders. That's not going to happen. The only way it's going to happen is if you start to find a new moral framework to apply to violent and serious offenders. Unless we find a way in our country, in our nation, and in our criminal justice system in this nation to shift our moral compass from retribution, retaliation, and revenge as a response to a violent or serious offense to redemption, restoration, and rehabilitation. Right. And until we're able to make that moral framework shift, until we're able to shift our moral compass in that way, we are never going to make deep cuts in racialized mass incarceration. In other words, we're going to have to abandon conventional morality as we know it now, which draws this deep distinction between violent and nonviolent offenders and says, we'll show leniency, compassion, and mercy for nonviolent offenders. But if you're a violent offender, the hell with you. Burn, eternally. We don't care. We don't give a damn about you until we scrap that moral compass and moral framework and moral response to violent and serious wrongdoers. We're never going to make deep cuts in mass incarceration.
Well, so which brings us to the $1 million question, right? Is that this is a process of, and from reading your book, what I viewed is a two-prong approach. One is the hearts and minds, right, of the public, like you said, this readjustment of morality. And then the second are the legal standards, right? You wrote pretty early in the book a lot about like mens rea, culpable mental states, and or the issues of luck, right? And two shooters, one shoots someone and the person lives, the other one shoots someone and they die. But we've given two very different moral classifications and legal classifications to each of those individuals. So I think that the legal process probably can be done through, progressive politicians, progressive DAs, more progressive. And when I say progressive, I recognize progressive today. Is it progressive enough? Right? We need to. If there's another word, the step beyond progressive is where we go. But how do we tackle the hearts and minds of individuals? How do we say that this person whose actions we view reprehensible, how do we change the minds of saying that this is still a human being? And by the way, that that whatever event happened, it didn't happen on the day of that event, right? A lot of these things are family driven or culturally driven, or not culturally but community driven, right? Deficiencies inside the community that all became contribution. How do we sway these minds?
Yeah, I have two responses to that. One of them has to do with art, right? The performing arts. And that's at the heart of this book. I used the performing arts in a play I called Race, Rap, and Redemption. I hope we can come back to it in a moment, to bond the audience members and members of the jury, so to speak, to a violent black criminal named Stanley Tukey Williams, who killed people with his own hands and co-founded the Crips. Okay, so arts, I'll come back to that in a moment. Please bring me back to that, Randy. But the other strategy I have in this book is to make arguments that are based on rationality and reason and logic. And, I hope that the reader is open to persuasion on the basis of information and data and rational arguments, right? And I hope that through those kinds of proofs and arguments in the book, I'm able to bring the reader to a place of epistemic humility. That's my ultimate goal, substantively. Epistemic humility about our capacity to make moral judgments of others and know the just deserts of others. And with that epistemic humility, once you have that kind of uncertainty about your own moral judgments, you're not so self-righteous about your moral judgments, then that should change a whole lot of your practices. My dad used to say, doubt may give your dinner a funny taste, but it's the lack of doubt that goes out and kills. It's that certainty, it's that absolute certainty that makes a person strap a bomb on his or her back and walk into a crowd and detonate it, into a crowded movie theater and detonate it. It is the lack of doubt, the damn sureness of our conclusions that allows us to strap a man or a woman down to a gurney or chair and pump them full of poisonous gas or fluids, right? And so I want to attack that kind of smug certainty we have about our moral judgments. And I do that through pointing out moral luck and how much room there is for bias in our moral judgments and all those ways. But at the end of the day, what I hope that means is somebody will say, well, hell, maybe I can't, with the certainty I used to think I could, assess someone's just deserts. And so I need to start to ratchet some of that back. For example, when it comes to the death penalty, once epistemic humility, once I have embraced epistemic humility about my capacity to know whether any person is the worst of the worst, right? How can you know? Once you go through the analysis that I take you through in the book, I hope we go through in the book, how can you know what seems to be the worst of the worst, who seems to be the worst of the worst truly is? And so that should make you much less likely to put people to death and by execution. It should make you much less likely to impose torture on them in the form of solitary confinement and other kinds of torturous conditions that we impose on people, and should hopefully have you start to look at them in a more human light. And that's what I'm striving to do with that part. And so I do that to change hearts and minds with logic, reason, proofs and arguments like that, Randy. And then the art part, which I can come back to if you'd like me to talk a little bit about art and justice.
Can I ask one thing about just to touch on what you just talked about? Hi, nice to meet you. I'm sorry I've been kind of quiet. I'm just listening to you guys talk. It's fascinating. So this idea that we need people to understand people in a different kind of way. Can you talk about the role that the idea of the reasonable person standard plays in American law and deciding guilt or innocence and how people should be punished, and how race may influence how people are judging what is a reasonable person and who is not a reasonable person? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. One of my first article in the Stanford Law Review was a piece called Race Ipsa Loquitur of intelligent Bayesians and voluntary Negrophobes and reasonable racists. And I specifically focused on the reasonable person standard test requirement in the criminal law. And I pointed out that it is everywhere. The reasonable person test is everywhere, all over the place in the criminal law. It's at the heart of negligence because the reasonable person test drives that. Recklessness, reasonable person standard is at the heart of that. Duress, self-defense, provocation, extreme emotional disturbance. You go up and down the black letter law. The reasonable person test is sitting there in the middle of it, helping to drive determinations of mens rea. The reasonable person test is really a mens rea test. We normally don't think of it that way. We normally think of mens rea as purpose, knowledge, recklessness, and negligence, right? And those are the kinds of mens rea they are. But within those requirements, like negligence and recklessness, is the reasonable person test. It's pivotal. The entire subjective culpability level turns on it. So I really, and in self-defense, it's the same way, and a lot of these other mitigations and exculpatory claims. So what I do is try to show, both in my earlier articles and in this book, what the reasonable person test actually does, how a fact finder, a juror, uses it. Because we spend a lot of time talking about abstract formulations of the law, and, how we're going to phrase this particular requirement or frame that one. But at the end of the day, we're giving legal directives to ordinary men and women who are sitting in a jury box, and we're trying to guide their discretion through these legal rules and standards. And so one of the standards we give them to guide their discretion about whether to convict or not this particular defendant, whether he or she is innocent or guilty of the crime charged, one of the main vehicles, legal vehicles we give them to guide their judgment is the reasonable person test. And the reasonable person test is malleable. It can be just about anything a jury wants it to be. It's often called the ordinary person test, the average, sometimes it's personified as, things like the man on the Clapham omnibus or is one English formulation. American one was, a man who takes his magazines at home and does his lawn in his shirt sleeves. The whole idea, historically it was a man. It had to be, it took some time for us to come around and recognize that it should be gender neutral. But still, the basis of it is typicality, ordinariness. As long as your responses to the world around you are typical, they're not blameworthy, right? That's the reasonable person test, pretty much in a nutshell. The implicit moral norm is blame is reserved for the statistically deviant, right? That's the implicit moral norm. But so what that says at the end of the day is, let's take a case like Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. People are often confused about those kind of cases. How could George Zimmerman have been acquitted in that kind of case? People said 17-year-old Trayvon Martin has some Skittles and a Arizona iced tea coming back from a convenience store and he's dead, and that's reasonable. How did that happen? Well, in any claim of self-defense like George Zimmerman made, what a judge essentially tells a jury to do through the reasonable person test. This is how the reasonable person test operates in a jury trial. Operationally, this is how it plays out. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, go back into that deliberation room, pull out a looking glass, a mirror, gaze into it. If you see George Zimmerman looking back at you, if you see the reflection of George Zimmerman looking back at you, you must acquit. That's what makes him reasonable, right? When a jury says, I can sympathetically identify with him, I do. In fact, the Model Penal Code explicitly says the reasonable person test is a vehicle for jury sympathy. They say it explicitly, right? So what you really have with the reasonable person test is an opportunity for a jury to either extend or withhold any sympathy it has for a defendant and to weigh any sympathy it has for that defendant against the sympathies it has for the victim. And then, the sympathies it has for the victim may depend on the racial identity of the victim. And the sympathy it has for the victimizer, the shooter, like George Zimmerman, may also turn on the racial identity of the victimizer and their own racial identity as jurors, right? And so the reasonable person test, to make a long story short now, or a little shorter, it's already, running long, is that the reasonable person test is a vehicle that allows ordinary stereotypes and prejudices of everyday people to come into the jury box and to determine the outcome of criminal cases over and over again.
And isn't this, I'm sorry, Tom.
I find this especially fascinating because I see this same phenomena play such a crucial role in evaluating police officer use of force cases. Yep. And I think in the vast majority of cases, it provides a vehicle to really lower the standards and not hold officers culpable because it's structured in such a way as to take the sort of lowest common denominator of an officer, what you could expect them to do given how poorly trained and supervised they are and all the problems in policing. Is this something that could reasonably a reasonable officer could do? And it's hard to find cases where I'm like, that's completely unreasonable because I'm aware of how deficient the institution is. That's one of the reasons I'm so interested in training reform. So my question is basically, if the standards, the training, and the expected capacities of police officers were higher, if society expected more and people within the institution expected more from police officers, would that then increase the level of culpability they may encounter when being evaluated on whether or not it was a reasonable thing for them to do? Or do you think it wouldn't matter?
I think it wouldn't matter. Wouldn't matter. I'll tell you why. I know we'd like to think it would matter. We have aspirations. We like to say, all we have to do. The reason it won't matter is because at the end of the day, you're going to have jurors who are making this value judgment about whether what the officer did was reasonable or not. And that is whether they sympathize with the officer or not. And they're going to sympathize with the officer, especially if we're talking about a black victim and somebody in a blue uniform. We've had, a lot of years of, television with shows like Law and Order, et cetera, that have made people very sympathetic, a lot of procedural shows that have made people in the general public just very sympathetic to police officers in self-defense cases. And I'm telling you, it's going to be very hard, even without a police officer. I'm going to be very if any ordinary person, George Zimmerman, anybody else, I'm going to be uneasy with a standard that says you have to be better than an ordinary person, or else you're going to be convicted of murder. You have to have more courage than an ordinary person somehow. You have to have better character than an ordinary person. Rather, here's what my conclusion is. The reasonable person test is going to result in a lot of acquittals of a lot of people a lot of the time, especially officers, but not just officers, people like George Zimmerman. When the victims are black, that's just what's going to happen. That's the reality. Tinkering with the standards ain't going to change that because the problems go deeper than that, right? Like we were talking about, they go to the stereotypes and prejudices that run throughout society and are baked into our very, kind of reflexes, our mental reflexes.
You're saying that they're going to see the image of themselves in the officer, no matter what.
Heck yeah, repeatedly. And so here's my conclusion. This is also from studies in the book that I cite. I was one of the first people in the legal literature, certainly in the critical race theories literature, to talk about unconscious bias in the criminal justice process, right? Before I started writing in this area, people like Chuck Lawrence were writing about unconscious bias, but they were talking about from a Freudian perspective, the id, the ego, and equal protection and stuff like that, and you're not going to buy that unless you buy the Freudian model. If you don't buy id, ego, and superegos and all that, if that's just fanciful to you, you're not going to be convinced by those arguments. So I look for information processing approaches to human cognition and that you could replicate in the laboratory with the stopwatches. And I started talking about, but we didn't call it implicit bias back then. We just called it unconscious bias rooted in the cognitive unconscious. Now they call it implicit bias. Okay. But I was really excited when I started writing about this. I was going around the country talking to police departments, to corrections officers, to all these people. This was in the early 90s, right? Nobody was talking about implicit bias, hardly, So I was out there running around talking about, hey, there's this thing that we have in us. It's unconscious bias. And even if we are racially liberal, even if we have the best of intentions, it can make us unconsciously discriminate against members of stereotyped groups, And so I was saying, and now we can get to the bottom of this problem and solve it, do something about it by becoming aware of it and practicing self-regulation of our stereotype responses, right? Now, I'm going to tell you 20 years later that I almost repent of what I did. I almost repent of it. But I very much know that a lot of what I did and identifying unconscious bias, what they call implicit bias now, provided a cover for a lot of police departments and other organizations to say that they were doing something when they really weren't doing anything, right? Because it's not, when you get implicit bias training or whatever you want to call it, you'll learn that we are all subject to unconscious bias against stereotype groups, right? That's true. All that's true. That's fine. It's great that we all learn that. But then we are given this false hope that we can do something about it, that we can control it, that somehow being aware of it will help us to regulate it. None of the studies that I'm looking at over the last 5 to 10 years support that conclusion. What they all point to is that, yeah, we learn about it, we can know it's there, and there's very little we can do about it. We still succumb to those unconscious, automatic, stereotype congruent responses, no matter how much we know about them. So what that means to me then is, if you want to minimize the harm that, for example, police officers, we're talking about police right now, we can talk about any other actors in society, but I'm going to focus on police because we give them a monopoly on legitimate violence. We give them the gun, the bullets, the stun gun, the mace, the billy club, the handcuffs. They are essentially our official violence workers, right? They're literally violence workers. Well, if you want to reduce or minimize the harm from your official violence workers to members of stereotyped communities, right? Marginalized communities, training them to get over their unconscious bias isn't going to do it. What you have to do is minimize the number of contacts between them and members of that group, right? Just minimize the contact. So they shouldn't be responding to mental health crises unless absolutely necessary. Shouldn't be responding to drug overdoses unless absolutely necessary. We can figure out all what that means. And like I said, one of the biggest breakthroughs I've seen is an attorney general of New York State finally saying what I've been saying all along. You don't need police officers out here enforcing vehicle codes either. You know, vehicular codes are just an excuse for profiling on wheels, right? We've allowed police officers to stop and frisk on wheels by saying you can make pretext stops. That is, if you have a hunch that this young black male over here may be up to no good, but that's just a hunch because all you have is he's a young black male in a car. That's all you got. So it's a hunch. So it doesn't rise to the level of reasonable suspicion under the Fourth Amendment. But the Supreme Court has said, if you find a scratch on the taillight, if you find something hanging from the rearview mirror, any minor infraction, you can use that as a pretext, a phony excuse to pull them over and act on that unconstitutional hunch that you had, right? We've given license to officers to stop and frisk on wheels, in other words, and that has caused a lot of the tension, but between officers and a lot of people in the minority communities. So unbundling, not defunding the police, because I know a lot of people are anxious about the word defunding the police. I don't know why. They were also anxious about Black Lives Matter and wanted to say all lives matter, blue lives matter. Anything protesters come up with, they're going to be upset about. But I'm going to just say unbundle the police, because a lot of my police friends and colleagues that I go back with, I belong to an organization called LEAP, Law Enforcement Action Partnership. They've been saying for years, you are saddling us police with too many responsibilities that aren't naturally ours. We're not street level social workers. Don't saddle us with too much. So that is what the upshot of some of these studies are. Minimize the contacts. Don't try to train your way out of unconscious bias.
Randy and I have talked about so much about if you're a police officer in any jurisdiction in the United States, you have a big chunk of a book full of traffic statutes in your state. And all you need to do is memorize 10 or 15 of those. And if you follow any vehicle in the United States, you're going to see some kind of traffic or equipment violation. And we also know that these pretextual stops, they impact different communities in different ways. Like it can have a really negative effect on public trust and the Black community specifically. So I look forward to finding, I think there's some technological promise that exists with automation and removing that function from policing. I would totally agree. I'm sorry to ask so many questions about that. Thank you for deviating.
No, I love it. I get home. I've gotten home. I'm sure some of the rest of folks who are watching this have had this experience. If you guys haven't, I've gotten home and doggone it, I open the mail and there I am. Yeah, you got me. There's the camera, and there I am going faster than I should be, and there's the ticket, right? And I'm like, there's nothing really I can much say. You kind of got me dead to rights. And we can do a lot more of that. And, what Black communities, like any other communities, what a lot of communities want, and I just put my druthers up front, okay? I'm not an abolitionist 100% at this point. That isn't to say I don't seek to strive toward abolition ultimately, but right now, I know that the Black community, like many other communities, wants good police work in this sense. They want murder solved, rape solved in their communities that are right now going unsolved. In a lot of communities, less than 20% of the rapes are going solved. And
Chicago, it's 5%.
Yes, and murder sometimes is 40, 35%. It can be shocking. And Black community members, like any community members, don't want murderers roaming the street, taking more innocent, vulnerable lives, or raping more innocent, vulnerable people, right? And so, but that kind of police work, solving murders, solving rape, solving crime, that's labor intensive, resource intensive. You can't, have a lot of your resources going toward turnstile jumpers and broken windows policing and a lot of other, kind of quality of life so-called policing, rather than, and having rape kit backlogs backing up. Whenever you have a rape kit backlog problem, that's not a resource problem. That's an allocation of resources problem. That's a priorities problem. You had money to hire new turnstile jumper police, 200 more in New York, but not to do something about those rape kit backlogs. So yeah, making police leaner and more focused and getting them to do the job that we all want them to do. Solve the murder, solve the rape, solve the violent crime. We all want that.
So, I didn't give really a formal introduction to Tom. Tom was a police officer as well in Phoenix, and he and I have talked about this too, about really the differences between defunding and abolishment. And I'm with you. I think it's a long-term goal, but I think we are still a very violent society. We're awash with guns. We have enormous problems with mental health issues. We have economic problems that are contributing to crime and those sorts of things. I'm with you. I find it incredibly insulting. You and I both live here in Los Angeles. 25,000 unsolved homicides. Right after George Floyd's death, the Los Angeles County DA's office, the sheriff's office, LAPD, and the FBI held a press conference so proudly to announce a task force to identify who was responsible for vandalism during protest. And I sat and watched and really kind of shock of saying just homicides, right? Not talking about shootings that didn't result in death, not talking about sexual assault cases, robberies, burglaries, other things. Where's the task force there? I have someone very close to me who works for LAPD in West Division. They spend resources putting bicycles decoy bicycles tied to a pole and then conduct surveillance to see who comes and steals the bicycle. And I just keep going back to 25,000 unsolved homicides. That's 25,000 families, friends, moms and dads and brothers and sisters and husbands and wives who don't have peace to understand, why is it that, the perpetrator of these crimes, that there's been no justice whatsoever.
I remember being drawn off of, I'm sorry, Randy, but I remember working on a robbery investigation where it was a series of robberies where they were going into a clerk's at Circle K's and sticking guns in their face and being pulled off of that to work with a group of people targeting people who were driving tamale carts on the street and selling food without a license. I'm sorry, that just came into my mind.
That's powerful. I'm glad. I mean, you folks are making the case more powerfully than any, I'll call us civilians. Anyone who hasn't actually had to worn that uniform and served. We can speak from a certain perspective, but when you're able to speak with that granular, detailed experience, it makes a world of difference. And so I really appreciate hearing you telling it like it is.
Well, thank you, Jody, for saying it. And yeah, I learned from a very wise person who said, which I've now repeated hundreds of times, is exploit your privilege. And part of the privilege that both Tom and I have is the ability to talk about the inside of this institution that is, typically speaking, very, very insulated. And it was always, I think, one of the best pieces of advice that you gave, because it is very difficult, because there's activists, there are people in the community who've been screaming about these problems for decades and decades and decades, and it's been dismissed. And when you have someone who's a former cop, especially someone who's white, then all of a sudden, right, I wrote the op-ed that I conferred with you about a few years ago, and that was one of the things I really struggled with. And then that went viral, and several 100,000 people read it from all over the globe. And I still remember thinking, like, this, I didn't say anything new. Nothing. There was nothing that I said that somebody else had not said was an experience to them previously. But being able to exploit that privilege helps. I just want to make one other point about traffic stops, and then I want to circle back to art before we run out of time. But one of the things that our organization has looked at is what were the calls for service when there's deadly use of force cases. And number one is domestic violence. And that's also the number one event that can happen for police officers to be killed. So it's deadliest for people, of the citizenry that has, that this intervention is happening with the police. And then it's very dangerous for the police as well. But number two is traffic stops. Mm-hmm. Right. So even those who tend to be a little bit more conservative or pro law enforcement, I don't like the separation, that I think policing does quite a bit, is, that their life is somehow inherently better or more valuable than someone else's. But even knowing that, unfortunately, there are a good amount of people that follow that kind of train of thought, that a cop's life is going to be more valuable than a quote unquote criminal, is that this is dangerous to them too, and it's unnecessarily dangerous. And Tom and I have talked about as well, like especially drug related cases. Almost all of the major drug cases that I had as a patrol officer was as a result of a pretext stop, pulling 100 pounds of marijuana out of a guy's car because of a focus and aim of headlight violation. But it was really because he wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't turn right on red. He wouldn't look at me. And it was suspicious, right? The whole thing. So you and I have talked about art, and, there's, if I may, there's a great irony, because in the early 1990s, I was in Cincinnati, and I was a union representative that kind of led the charge in our agency for the boycott of Interscope Records. And I think Time Magazine or the Time Corporation had something to do with it as well. And because of NWA and, especially their song, Fuck the Police. And but then it was just a couple of years later that I was introduced to Tupac, and really for the very first time in my life. And I remember a line out of Changes that said, instead of a war on poverty, there's a war on drugs so the police can bother me. And that fundamentally changed my life. That fundamentally changed how I viewed the criminal justice system. It was really at that moment that I was something so obvious, right? I mean, kind of like what Tom just talked about, that instead of investigating robbers, where there could be some serious injury, he's chasing around somebody, relative to, food regulation or something. So it impacted me for sure. So, I can be a testament to your statement that the arts can really can shape hearts and minds. How do we take this to the next level?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, Fuck the Police, I remember that was the first gangster rap song I'd ever heard in my life. And I knew that this was a new kind of art form, because when I was walking down Bancroft Street from my class in constitutional law at Berkeley, and some students across the street, there was a frat house, and so they had the speakers pointed out the windows, as some frat houses are wont to do. And I heard a sound that I'd never heard before. Nothing like this kind of music. This is West Coast. Then it migrated back to the East Coast, the home of hip hop, and they picked it up. People like, Nas and Jay-Z, et cetera. But this was a West Coast art form. And here's what I heard when I was walking down that street. Fuck the police coming straight from the underground. A young nigga got it bad because I'm brown and not the other color, so police think they have the authority to kill a minority. What do you call that but political speech? What is that but political speech, right? How does that not anticipate Black Lives Matter by about 20 years, right? How is that not speaking to the race? Yes, it's using profanity, but that's the point. To be profane as a way of being disruptive, right? That is one of the hallmarks of Black Lives Matter, of their methodology. First, it's disruption, right? Shut it down. We got to cut through our collective complacency about racial injustice by disruption and shutting it down, right? And then part two, uncomfortable conversations. Let's compel some uncomfortable conversations. Well, the N-word and that profane delivery was disruptive. I even dropped it when I went to the American Association of Law Schools annual meeting, and I was going to address them in 1999, this room full of Tweety law professors about criminal justice matters. And they were expecting me to talk about information processing approaches to human cognition and all that and how it connects to the criminal justice system. But before I went, I'd gone down to San Pedro Terminal Island and talked to the guards about unconscious bias and saw all those faces in those cages, all those black faces disproportionately staring back out at me. And it struck me again how inhumane it was. So when I got to the stage that in New Orleans for the annual meeting, I was not mincing words. I said I had a speech prepared, and they actually found this speech that I gave. I thought it was lost forever, but they found it and reproduced it in a Los Angeles Review of Books piece I did on a film review called on Straight Outta Compton when that came out. But anyway, I told them, I was going to come up here and, engage in the usual euphemisms of the academy, the calcified language of the academy about, mass incarceration, but nothing viscerally registers the reality of what's going on with mass incarceration, like walking into those prisons and looking in those cages, in those eyes of those prisoners. And you don't want to just sit around and bandy, grand generalities with law professors anymore, I told them. And then I launched into 16 bars, Grandy, of Ice Cube's America's Most Wanted, all right, with lines like kicking shit called street knowledge, why more niggas in the pen than in college? Because that line, I must be your cellmate, all of that. So, and it was disruptive. Let me put it this way. It took about 16 years to invite me back. So I didn't get any immediate invites back, but we had some uncomfortable conversations, and that's what the art form was striving to do. So, and that's why it was, as aggressive as it was and confrontational as it was, because it was talking about some confrontational reality. But I used that art form, gangster rap, especially not the guy you're talking about, who I love, Tupac, right? I opened the book with a quote from him. He's one of the first people I quote in the book because he is that transformational. He was so young and so powerful to be as young as he was. And I put on a play over at Bovard Auditorium for about 1,100 students. You can see it on YouTube, Race, Rap, and Redemption. And the call of the question I open the play with is, you are going to be the judge. You sit 1,200 students, faculty, and staff. The call of the question for the night is, should we pour liquor for Tukey? Should we pour liquor for Stanley Tukey Williams, who had just been put to death when Arnold Schwarzenegger denied his plea for a stay, right? And The call of the question then was, should we pour liquor for two? That is, engage in a libation ceremony that expresses ritualistic solidarity with a cold-blooded first-degree murderer. I'm not talking about low-level nonviolent drug offenders here, right? A cold-blooded first-degree murderer who co-founded the Crips, right? That's who I want to talk about. That's who I wanted us to get into, right? And I knew that I was not going to be able to persuade them to feel any kind of sympathetic identification with this violent serious criminal, just by making a lot of lawyerly arguments. I knew that art is what you need. Art is something that can transform hearts and minds like nothing else. So what I did was have basically a closing argument for the damned, in which I gave a little propositional content in Exhibit A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. So I give a little statement, Exhibit A, another little statement, Exhibit B. And each exhibit was an artistic performance. So it was like Lula Washington's Dance Company doing a modern dance to Tupac Shakur's Brenda's Got a Baby. And Brenda's Got a Baby is a story, is a rap he wrote when he was 17, 18 about a 12-year-old black girl who's raped, has a kid, a community turns its back on her, she winds up in prostitution, and the last couplet is prostitute found slain and Brenda's her name, she had a baby. And then we asked the question, what if that baby Brenda had was Stanley Tukey Williams? Now, he goes into the foster system, and so many of these guys, when I go up to San Quentin, from the foster system, and as part of that system, he's disciplined by being thrown into car trunks when he's 3 and 4 years of age and having it slammed on him for 4 and 5 hours at a time. It's discipline, cigarette burns, molestation. Okay, and now we have to judge them. So I get art performance after art performance, right? Along those lines, Macy Gray's Music Orchestra, Lula Washington, Saul Williams, Ice Cube performing live. By the end of the night, you had nearly 1,100 students, faculty, and staff standing up with their lighters in the air for Stanley Tukey Williams, because that's the power of art. The power of art to draw you into its narrative perspective and change hearts and minds. And it tied into what I do when I go to San Quentin with my students, and we do a program called No More Tears, a restorative justice program. We sit down with mothers of murder victims, lifers, life without parole folks, right? And students in my seminar. And here's how a typical session would go. A mother of murder victim stand up and say, this is my loved one. This is the one that was torn from our family. It destroyed us as a family to lose this person. Here's the pain and suffering it caused. And they'll pass the picture around. And we'll sit there with that, right? And then a lifer will stand up. And let's say he has 10 minutes. He'll spend the first 5 minutes saying, this is the person whose life I took. Here's the family I harmed, destroyed, agreed, right? Here's the pain and suffering I caused. And if he has any pictures, he'll pass them around. And then in the last 5 minutes, he'll say, whoever did that to that victim was a depraved individual. I did that, I was a depraved individual. But let me tell you how I became that depraved individual. And they'll go into these kinds of stories. That's a shocking number of them, foster care and stuff. You see these stories of just savage beatings and unmitigated squalor. And you come to really recognize, and you sit there with that, right? We all sit there with that. And we come to recognize two things. One, it's much harder than you normally think to distinguish between victims and victimizers. Many victimizers are themselves victims, right? So the moral universe right away becomes more complicated, number one. And number two, you recognize that hurt people hurt people. That's really what a lot of this kind of boils down to, that recognition that hurt people, and suddenly and this brings it full circle, Randy. I guess this is where we might close it out. It brings you to a sense of epistemic humility about your capacity to judge the just deserts of others. How well can you really know while you're, being self-righteous in your indignation and slinging all these draconian punishments around? How can you really know that this person deserves all of the contempt that you're heaping on them?
Absolutely, and I'll just say that the early indictment that I've had and I maintain today is an oversimplistic ideas of life and criminality, especially where the police are taught that there's really just two people in the world. They're good people and evil people, and so if you take that approach, then yes, policing is much easier because you just go after the evil ones because you're the good ones, right? And
Randy, we used to think that the evil ones were the ones who smoked a joint, right?
Right.
Smoking those joint
very
smokes.
Subjective, isn't it? Yes. Yeah, it sure is. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mr. Armour, thank you very, very much. And of course, we, like I said at the beginning, I think we could have gone on for a couple of more hours, if not days. I had like the list of questions, and I got through a couple of them. But once again, if you haven't already, go out and grab Mr. Armour's book. It is in *GGA Theory. There'll be a link below in our podcast to get to his website and a link to be able to purchase the book. And thank you very much for your time and your insight, Jody. And I look forward to talking with you again real soon.
Thank you so much as well. And we'll put a link to the performance that you mentioned in as well. So, but thank you very much. It was great meeting you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated this conversation.